In the next couple of lectures, we're going to talk about a movement that happened in the United States during the early 90s, and that had to do with repressed and recovered memories. If you recall to your intro psych class, Freud talked a lot about repression as one of the defense mechanisms that people use in order to avoid something that is very traumatic. So when information is so painful for the ego to deal with, it was put out of consciousness. The problem, of course, according to Freud, was that even though the information was underneath a person's consciousness, it still caused problem for the patients. So it might come out in other ways. So according to Freud, then, some of the psychological problems that his patients were presenting with might have been due to memories that they were pushed aside and were too painful for them to deal with. Well, in the early 90s, what happened in this country, many practitioners, mental health practitioners in the United States, began to claim that hundreds and thousands of adults, primarily women, were victims of repressed and recovered memories of sexual abuse. And the question that came up in the 90s was this, was something unusual going on in the United States? Was the therapy that these people were doing finally uncovering some horrible abuse that was prevalent in the United States? Or was this an example of what we would call adult suggestibility? In order to look at that, let's take a look at what was going on during that time, and I'll give you some examples of some of the cases. The first case to go to court of a repressed memory was Eileen Franklin. This was a landmark case that happened in 1990 in Redwood City, California. The defendant in this case was Eileen Franklin's father, George Franklin. He was 51 years old and he stood trial for a murder that had occurred 20 years earlier. The victim in that case was a little girl, an 8-year-old named Susan K. Nason, and she was a friend of Eileen Franklin. And Eileen was 8 years old at the time herself. I'll show you this short video so that you can get a sense of what this case is about.
"57-year-old George Franklin has spent the last 6 years in prison for murder, sentenced to life based on the memories of his own daughter. And this testimony.
And I had the memory of my father with a rock in his hands approaching Susan Nason. He had both of his hands above his head.
The case was a first for the controversial use of so-called repressed memory testimony. In 1989, Franklin's daughter Eileen testified that she recovered a 20-year-old memory of the murder of her childhood friend, an 8-year-old girl.
Are you guilty of the crime that put you in here?
No.
Eileen Franklin said she repressed her memory of the murder out of fear. But now her testimony is suspect. Eileen's sister revealed only recently that Eileen's recovered memory had followed hypnosis, making it inadmissible in California. Prosecutor James Fox.
And she also claims that the psychiatrist told her that she had been hypnotized.
With Eileen no longer a credible witness, prosecutors say there is not enough evidence to try him again. The daughter's credibility was also questioned when she accused her father of yet another murder. He was never charged, and recent DNA tests cleared him. Today, George Franklin goes free, and the 27-year-old murder of a child is again unsolved.
So this particular case was, as you can tell, got national attention. George Franklin spent many years in jail, so obviously the jury bought this story. And so this case sort of started a flood of cases in the United States. There were lots of high-profile cases that happened throughout the 90s. One of the cases was Holly Ramona. The reason why this case was it was such a lightning rod was that Holly Ramona was the daughter of a wine country executive in Northern California, and she accused her father of sexually abusing her after she recovered memories of abuse. The interesting part of this story is that Mr. Ramona was an extremely wealthy executive in the wine industry. He was fired from his position, losing a $275,000 a year position. And he ended up suing Holly Ramona's therapist for the kind of therapy that she underwent. By the way, Holly's mother sided with her and divorced her father. So this was a case that, of a family falling apart in front of the nation. Another person that accused parents of sexual abuse was Roseanne Barr. She's a comedian who had a very big hit comedy show at the time. Also, uh, a former Miss America, Marilyn Van Derber, also accused her parents of sexually abusing her as a child, again, with a repressed and recovered memory. So what's going on here? What was happening? Well, virtually every single person who claimed to have recovered a memory of abuse was undergoing therapy at the time that they made this discovery. So the person making the accusation was in therapy. Interesting thing about the therapy, the clients were given a special kind of therapy called recovered memory therapy. And they were given books to read about repressed memory. One of the most popular books was this book called The Courage to Heal. And what happened in The Courage to Heal is it was sort of a guide for how to recover memories of abuse. And the patients were told things like, don't worry if you can't remember it right away. If you feel it might have happened, it probably did, and so forth and so on. Then what would happen is the person would undergo months or even years of these special therapies. And sooner or later, these recovered memories emerged. Now, it was getting so bad in this country at the time that there were a couple of people that didn't believe that this was a real phenomenon. And they tried to uncover whether or not the therapists that were engaging in this therapy were doing something fishy. So, for example, one private investigator was hired by a family, and she went to a therapist. And what she did was, as you know, she's a pseudo patient, right? She went to the therapist, and what she did was she complained about having nightmares and having trouble sleeping. And on the third time that she visited the therapist told her that she was an incest survivor. In other words, you're a classic case of an incest survivor. There was another case where CNN in 1993, they sent in an undercover reporter who was supposed to act like a patient. The patient, air quotes, complained about feeling depressed and having relationship problems with her husband. So in the first session, the therapist diagnosed her as an incest survivor and even told her that she was a classic case of an incest survivor. When the reporter returned for a second session, she told the therapist, she says, this doesn't make any sense because I don't remember anything like that. I didn't have any incest and I don't remember it. The therapist told her that her reaction was typical and that she had a repressed memory because the trauma was so terrible. So there were some indications. There were some people who were not buying what was going on, but in fact, there were lots of people who did. Oh, by the way, what happened was these patients did not, when you go to therapy, you expect to get better. You expect that once you've reveal the trauma, everything, you start to feel better. You're supposed to get better over time. In fact, what happened with a lot of these clients, these patients, they didn't get better. They got worse and worse and worse and worse. And then all of a sudden, what you'd see is you'd have multiple personalities emerge. Again, I'm going to use air quotes around emerge since you can't see me. And how do you explain this? Well, what often happened is the client would get a diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality. And of course, with that kind of a severe disorder, you wouldn't expect that person to get better right away. So there was a big mess in this country. So let's take a look at some of the techniques that these therapists were using in their therapy sessions with these clients. One such technique is a technique that's called guided imagery. Guided imagery is where The client is not asked to discover the truth, not what really happened to you, but to let your mind wander and think about what could have happened. Um, Maybe the therapist would ask you to bring a photo album to the therapy, and you might point out a photo and say, what's that a picture of? And then maybe say, oh, that was my 5th birthday. Well, let's work off of that picture. Let's think about what could have happened on that day, and let your mind wander, and don't worry if it's true or not. Let's talk about what might have happened. Another thing that uh, therapists used was hypnosis, and you saw that in the Franklin case. The therapist used hypnosis to get a memory out. The third thing was journaling. Journaling was a technique where after your guided imagery and you start thinking about things, write them down. Write down what you think might have happened and read them to yourself to make them more real. That's what people were instructed, to make them more real. Another one, of course, was dream interpretation. As you might guess, many of the dreams were interpreted as confirming sexual abuse. Another thing was body memories. This one is one that always cracks me up because what patients were often told. So, for example, let's say you came in and you said that you were experiencing headaches the last couple of days. Your therapist would say things like, that's good, that's good. Your body is starting to remember the abuse. In other words, any kind of pain you had, think about what they're saying here. They're saying that parts of your body can remember things. So, for example, if your elbow was aching, it's your body remembering abuse. I mean, we all know where memories are stored. They're stored in the brain. They're not stored in your elbow. But yet patients, bought into that. Like, oh my gosh, my body's starting to remember before I am. So body memories was another big deal. Another thing that would happen was, if you weren't able to recover memories right away, you might join a group of survivors. And so these were groups of people who had repressed and recovered memories. And so working within a group then helped you to recover the memories of abuse. They might be weekly meetings or weekend meetings that you do to help you recover the memories. And this was going on in this country. Let me just give you a little quote from a self-help book. Just think about this. This is what people were instructed to do. Spend time imagining that you were sexually abused without worrying about accuracy, proving anything, or having your ideas make sense. Ask yourself these questions. What time of day is it? Where are you? Indoors or outdoors? What kinds of things are happening to you? Is there one or more person with you? Imagine this kind of therapy going on and how it might have affected those who were looking for help. Now, you might think that this all seems very silly. However, our country bought into it hook, line, and sinker. And there was a legal response. What was going on at this point, suppose even for a moment that repressed memories were true and all of these cases were absolutely true. For many of these cases, the statute of limitations had run out. So they couldn't prosecute a sexual abuse that had occurred like 30, 35 years before. And just to show you how much we took this information as the truth, there was a legal response in the states. What the states started doing was delaying reporting statutes. So, and they did it one of two ways. One is they extended the statutes. So, for example, if the statute of limitations said 15 years, they might extend the statute of limitations so that it was 40 years. So, extending the statute to the reporting statutes. Another group of states was they tolled the statutes. Tolling is a little bit different. Tolling is the statute of limitations begins when you remember the abuse. So if you recovered the memory of abuse when you're 28, that was when the statute of limitations began. Just to tell you, just to show you as an example about our country, by 1995, 1/3 of the states in this country had extended or told um, the statutes. Montana, for example, and Wyoming actually use tolling. And you could bring legal action against a perpetrator up to 3 years after the discovery of the crime. So that's when you discovered the crime. By the end of the 1990s, there were only 5 states in the country that hadn't extended or told their statutes. So what was happening in this country is you had thousands of people alleging sexual abuse, and the courts and the laws and the statutes were altered to allow these cases to come to court. And surprisingly enough, many, many people were found guilty and sentenced to jail. So I'm going to stop here because I've just outlined the problem. Now, in the next lecture, what I'm going to do is tell you about the research that looked into some of these therapies to see whether or not some of these therapies might have been leading to false memories of sexual abuse. Okay, thank you.